Live feed, we will start as soon as that's up and running.
It's up and running.
All right, thank you. All right, Council, I'd like to call this regular Council meeting of October 11th, 2022 to order with adoption of the agenda. Someone want to make that motion for me? Councilor Sherlett, second by Councilor Palmer. All in favor? Motion's carried. Adoption of the minutes of the regular Council meeting of September 27th. Councilor Palmer.
Sorry to corporate admin, but I forgot to mention, but after 10, should note that I left the meeting.
Okay. So just on those minutes after 10, you left the meeting. So corporate admin will make that adjustment. Thank you, Councilor. And then adoption of those minutes as amended. Councilor Sherlett, Councilor Palmer, all in favor? Motion's carried. Any business arising from those council meeting minutes? Councilor Elliott.
We've had a presentation from Adrian on the tiny home proposal several times over the last couple of years. And I'm still not sure whether Revelstoke as a community has a bylaw that enables these things to be put in to our community. If they have an R1 lot, is a tiny home eligible to be placed on that lot? If it meets code or if it meets the CSA standard, do we accept tiny homes into our community?
So it's all going to be a zoning issue. So Mr. Simon, if you could weigh in on that, please.
Through your worship to Councillor Elliott, you are correct. A single family dwelling is a permitted use in the zoning bylaw. And essentially a single family dwelling is described as a permanent dwelling that's on a continuous foundation. So if someone can propose something that complies with BC building code, or alternatively, like a mobile home that's placed on a permanent foundation can comply with CSA standards, then it would be permitted. Whether or not you want to call that a tiny home, that's okay. I know that there's a few developers in town that can build very, very small homes that comply with BC building code. So those would already be permitted under the zoning regulation. The challenge becomes meeting BC building code, the smaller you get, or meeting CSA standards. And when you place them on wheels, it becomes even more challenging to meet those requirements.
So
Go ahead, follow up.
So everything we've heard up to this point is multiple tiny homes on a lot. Whether we donate the lot as which is the housing society has asked for, or some kind of proposal. I'm wondering, is that feasible under our bylaws?
Mr. Simon.
Through your worship, I just want to clarify, are you referring to a circumstance where it would be one single lot, there would be multiple dwelling units in the form of a tiny home that would be on wheels, but somehow meets a CSA standard? Is that what the situation?
Wheels or cabins, yeah, on a foundation, as long as there are multiple units on a single lot.
Through your worship, we wouldn't have a standard residential zone that would allow for that right now. It would have to meet the density requirements. So right now, if you're in a single family zone, for instance, which is what you're referring to, it's a single family dwelling in the end.
Or any zoning, do we have any zone that would enable that?
Through your worship, you're only allowed one dwelling unit per lot. So if they wanted to do a bare land strata or a subdivision to allow for multiple dwelling units on small lots, that's something that could be accomplished through a comprehensive development zone to have lots that are smaller than our current R1 lots. There's a few different avenues that you could certainly go about it. But in the end, the big challenge for these tiny homes, it's not so much a zoning challenge. It's a challenge in meeting DC building code for a dwelling or CSA standards for a dwelling.
Councilor Palmer.
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. Just sort of further to the conversation, one of the successes of this council is we have enabled hundreds of tiny homes. Where? That's not the principal building, but the secondary building in the form of carriage houses and garden suites.
Okay.
And if you define them, a tiny home, however that's defined, I think a lot of this is about semantics, but we have enabled realistically hundreds of tiny homes, and they're coming in that form.
Okay, thanks for your comments. Further.
So if those tiny homes are on wheels, this is not the case. Those carriage homes are not enabled, right? That you couldn't consider a wheeled tiny home a carriage house.
Mr. Simon, comment, if there's wheels on them, they then become a mobile home, is that correct?
Through your worship, if a house is placed on wheels, it essentially becomes a recreational vehicle. That's what it is. It's a temporary dwelling that can be moved from place to place to place. Those are already permitted on campgrounds. So in the end, I know there's a lot of discussion about the whole tiny homes. It's essentially three different types of dwellings you can think of it as. A really small home that meets BC building code on a permanent foundation, that's a single family dwelling. That is permitted in a variety of areas in the city right now. A mobile home, so a tiny home that's not on a permanent foundation, but anchored in just like a mobile home. It's a mobile home. It's zoned in every part of the city that allows for mobile homes, being the R5 and the R5A zone. And then the last one, a tiny home on wheels that meets CSA standards. It's a recreational vehicle and it would be permitted in areas that are zoned for campground, essentially. So that's really where we're at. In creating a specific zone to accommodate the ones on wheels, that becomes a challenge because it is a temporary dwelling. If you want to create a zone that enables small lot development for homes that meet BC building code or meet CSA standards for mobile homes and are placed on a permanent foundation, then that's something that's already identified in the OCP to be developed.
So the proposal that we've had several times is multiple homes on or establishing a tiny home village. And the most recent one, the Housing Society was in support of this endeavor. So what stage should we put this to? Should we put this into a zoning change or a bylaw change? Or because it seems like everyone's wasting their time on looking at this thing. Unless we face those regulations first, then we're going around the circle.
Okay, your comments noted. Do you want an answer to that, or?
Well, please, this discussion, this is, you know, we should be deciding whether we ask bylaws to be changed.
Okay. Councillor Charlotte.
Through your worship, I think we have discussed this from a few different angles. We have had these presentations come forward. So far, there has not been a proposal on a specific lot that has come to city staff, but the impression I get is that they're ready and willing to work with any proponent that wants to make this happen. The challenge comes from the economics of it and the funding of it, which Mr. Giacca and the Housing Society have been looking at various different angles for. It's a complicated question because you're also asking about the tiny homes on wheels, which is not what they're speaking of. They're talking about a house on a foundation and figuring out how the lots look and what that servicing looks like. For the tiny homes on wheels that we're seeing a lot of people posting about on Revy Rentals, Revelstoke community, where we don't have enough housing this winter. There's people that have vans and campers and tiny homes that they're used to being able to plug in somewhere, which technically is illegal, not or against our bylaws in our community, as far as I'm aware. So that in itself is a separate conversation, and I think a bigger one to look at what would that look like to enable just to get through this winter or some sort of short-term solution, but beyond the scope of this council's work.
Well, I mean, we've had the KOA, this place up by Johnson Heights.
Mm-hmm.
I look at that and I say, I mean, first of all, 90% of the tiny homes are on wheels. Right, that's the building on a trailer. That's the principle of the idea, and that's how it evolved. You can move this after a number of years if you decide to move, or you can just leave it permanent. But that's the reality. We have RVs, cabin sites. Why do we limit them to 6 months a year? Why couldn't you park there and live there if you chose? They live in Arizona. They go down there and people live in trailers. I mean, I'm just throwing that out there. We're looking at affordability and find a way to get people into something that's livable. It's there.
Well, I mean, so you need to look at the people that own these facilities, these campgrounds and whatnot. It's their decision to operate them during the period of time. So it's not us saying, hey, you have to be open. It's them saying, from a financial perspective, this isn't of any benefit to us. And that's the reason. So that doesn't mean that we can't continue to look for alternatives as we move forward, but the answer isn't that instant.
Here's one more question now. Can you put a tiny home on wheels in a trailer park that we have currently in place?
Mr. Simon.
Through your worship, that wouldn't be permitted unless recreational vehicle was a listed use in the zone, which it currently is not. Again, think of it as three different types of dwellings: standard single family dwelling, a mobile home that complies with CSA, I think it's CSA Z240 standard. And then you would have a recreational vehicle that has its own other certification process. In a mobile home park, mobile homes are the listed use, and mobile homes would be defined as a building that complies with that CSA standard. So when you're placing something on there, it needs to comply and you would need to have a building permit for it. If the building inspector received a building permit application for a tiny home on wheels, there wouldn't be anything in the building code to currently evaluate it against and issue a permit for it. That is the challenge with a tiny home. If it gets approved as a recreational vehicle, then it's intended to be something that's for temporary accommodation. The provincial regulations that legislate how we issue permits for dwellings have not been amended or updated to capture this unique circumstance.
Could you qualify a tiny home on wheels as an RV and just open the RV park year round?
Through your worship, that's certainly something that someone could seek to do to get their CSA certification. It does start to bring up these other questions, though, of how do you service these developments that are intended to be temporary or seasonal in nature for year-round accommodation? What happens when someone, drives their home off the lot? What entitlements do they have? It is a situation that isn't fully flushed out yet, and I haven't seen a proposal that fully deals with that operational element.
Great, thank you. Thank you all for the conversation. Any other business arising from the minutes?
Let somebody else say that.
Okay, Councillor Charlotte.
Just a quick comment, the Housing Action Plan does call for policy work and reviewing where our abilities and jurisdictions sit and what kind of advocacy we should be doing. So this sounds like a policy review kind of conversation as part of the Housing Action Plan to look at what are the barriers and what can we do and where can we advocate? Because mayor and council have that voice to bring to the provincial government and to do it in partnership with other communities that are facing these same challenges. So that it's not just Revelstoke advocating for these changes, it's also some other comparable resort communities that are facing this issue right now and have some ideas to help push the regulations and guidelines ahead. But that, I think the Housing Action Plan does call for that work, so we should see that in the next year or so.
My comment is that we've had 4 years of looking at it, because I've heard this thing 4 times. And the latest one has the full support of the Housing Society. And I'm saying, well, when does it get addressed? Right? We have an option. We've been facing this housing crunch for a while. Why couldn't we have done something sooner? And I'm not waiting for anybody. We could be the leaders, which is in our mandate, our mission, to be a leader in a number of approaches to things. We could be a leader.
Good. Thank you. Appreciate your comments. Anything further? Any other business arising from the minutes? Seeing none, let's move on to 6, announcements from the mayor. Just want to let everybody know, remind everyone, the election is on the 15th, Saturday, this coming Saturday, the 15th, with the advanced polls on tomorrow, Wednesday. Polls are open 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Everything is at the Revelstoke Recreation Center. Let's move on to 9A, bylaws, zoning amendment bylaws. Someone want to put that on the table for me, please? Councillor Charlotte.
That zoning amendment bylaw number 2346 be read a first time.
Seconder for that motion, please. I'll move that as a second. Discussion on the motion. So I will start. This is a comprehensive development zone change. Mr. Simon, did you want to do a bit of a presentation before we weigh in? How do you feel?
Through your worship, I'm able to give a general synopsis of the text amendment, if that's something that council would like to see.
Yes, please.
Through your worship, so essentially what we have here is a request from Revelstoke Mountain Resort for a zoning bylaw text amendment that would allow density to be shifted between some of the 10 development areas. So when the CD zone to establish development for the resort was completed, I believe it was back in 2006, the report has kind of a chronology when it occurred. So it was 2007. The bylaw to establish the CD zone created 10 different development areas. Now, each of those 10 different development areas was allocated a specific amount of density. So a certain number of dwelling units, as well as a certain amount of commercial floor area space. Now, with that development and with that table that outlined the different densities, it was based on the resort development plan that was done. And it was very rigid with where that density was going to go. Area 1, you're allocated X amount. Area 2, you're allocated X amount, and so on all the way through the 10 areas, with no ability to shift density between the different development areas. So when you look at the overarching plans for Revelstoke Mountain Resort, the resort development plan, the master development agreement that's issued by the province, it speaks towards flexibility, and even our own OCP, those RMR development area guidelines, they speak towards flexibility to allow density to be shifted between the development areas as deemed suitable for the desired outcome of the development context. So right now, the situation that we find ourselves in is areas 1 and 10, which if you look on the first map in the report, those are the main resort core areas. And you can see if you cross-reference that with the density table, being table 1, it's in the CD zone and it's also in the staff report. There is a significant amount of density that is allocated to those 2 areas. Now, when you look at areas 4 and 5, for example, you'll see very, very little density allocated to them, 10 units for one and 50 units for another, with no commercial floor space allocated there. Now, the original idea is that a golf course was going to be running east-west with main access to the resort coming in off of Airport Way and then meandering east towards the resort core. Now, plans have shifted at the resort. So instead of that golf course going east-west, it's going north-south along Camosie Road, and Camosie Road has been realigned from the roundabout in front of Mackenzie Village, leading into the resort core. So that's part of the reason why these areas weren't allocated much density. So what the amendment seeks to do is allow for a reallocation of density from area 1, being that main resort core area, to other development areas, so long as no more than 30% of the overall density is allocated out of area 1, with a cap of no more than 15% being reallocated to any one specific area. So what this amendment does in the end is it allows flexibility in shifting density out of area 1, which is this, presently hyperdense area under the current framework in the zoning bylaw, to be reallocated to other areas to be dispersed a little bit more effectively, rather than hyperdensifying that core. So that's a general essence towards the intent of this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Simon. I appreciate that. Any councillors have a comment? Councillor Ryan.
Yes, I'm curious what the engagement looked like in 2007 when those 10 development areas were originally set.
Any information on that, Mr. Simon? I know that goes back before your time.
Yeah, through your worship, it's a little bit back before my time. My understanding when this process unfolded is that the engagement undertaken to not only craft those Revelstoke Mountain Resort development area guidelines that are currently in an appendix of the OCP, but as well as the CD zone and to finalize this resort development plan, is that the engagement was quite robust. I don't have the specific details and numbers of how many turned out for the engagement. But one really important thing to note with this flexibility, and it's noted in the OCP as well, you'll see an action item in the OCP that speaks towards revisiting these development area guidelines, seeing whether or not they're still suitable to accommodate not only the needs of the resort, but very importantly, the needs of the community. So that is an action item we have in the OCP, and allowing for this flexibility kind of kickstarts what we would envision as more of a comprehensive neighborhood planning process to really look at, where is the resort going to be going over the next 10, 15 years. This amendment gives them some flexibility to play with some numbers and do some more comprehensive master planning. But then we can go out to the community and work with the resort to say, what is this neighborhood going to look like, complete the master infrastructure planning that's already underway with Director Black and his group, and really give the community a better idea of how this resort is going to unfold as development progresses, which not only gives more certainty to the resort, but also would provide certainty for the community as to what the expectations are for the resort to provide and give back to the community as well, and then vice versa. So it is part of that bigger, more comprehensive picture as well.
Great, thank you. Follow up, Council.
Yeah. So is there a reason that the resort has given for why they decided to change those plans and place the golf course in a different area?
So through your worship, and again, I can't speak directly for them, but in our conversations with them, it really does have to do with a lot more robust ground truthing is happening at the resort. So, the original plan was developed, I believe, sometime around 2003, 2004. Things have changed substantially since then, right? Not only has ownership of the resort changed, but also all the work on the ground has changed dramatically. So going out and doing geotech testing and finding out that areas where they thought may have been suitable building sites have so many geotechnical constraints or environmental constraints that they're no longer going to be able to build there. And not only that, certainly market changes as well, right? Looking at what the needs of the community are, what the needs of the market are to ultimately facilitate that. So there's been certainly that ground truthing element, but also, the market changes. And I will note that, the OCP as well as the provincial approvals that have been issued for the resort, they all speak towards this idea of flexibility. They all speak towards that these are concepts that have been developed and that their understanding is that as ground truthing occurs and as market conditions change, there is a need for flexibility. So right now, all these approval documents we have in place, the only one that doesn't provide that flexibility is the zoning bylaw. So this amendment is really seeking to get that zoning bylaw more in line with not only the provincial approvals, but as well as the OCP.
Just one last one. It feels like the development's really just shifting from where it would, like, I understand that ground truthing would reveal like more information that they probably didn't have, but even as a lay person looking at the land, it kind of seems like they're taking what would obviously be a more expensive place to develop and shifting it to what is flatter and easier to develop. So those market changes is kind of just like, oh, well, it's more expensive to build and there's more environmental concerns. So I guess what I'm just concerned about is like the optics of giving the resort that flexibility when that was probably somewhat obvious at the beginning.
Through your worship, in terms of, I'm not sure if that was a question.
No, just a statement, no question.
Good. And so I look at it, this, in my mind, is a positive moving forward for our community. It allows some of the densification onto some of that flatter land where it will be probably less expensive to build when I look at, where it is. And that might give the opportunity for residents to be able to purchase. So I think it's a positive as we move forward that way, but also gives kind of a plan for the whole neighborhood to see some development, some housing, instead of a golf course right along some of these roads. We're actually going to see some densification, some housing. So I think that's a positive as we move forward. And as Mr. Simon has said, we kind of look at the ability to move that densification might be helpful to the community, also helpful to the resort. Not might, it is. And so I think this is a positive. Councilor Brooksville.
I have a question. So the table has, sort of the different types of units. So when we're talking about shifting densification, are we, there's some, for example, there's some areas that show commercial and 3 out of the 10 and then 7 out of the 10 do not. So would this allow the resort to bring commercial into areas that before they would not have had that opportunity?
Mr. Simon?
Through your worship, yes, it would. And one of the things I would note that's unique about the CD8 zone is every single area within the CD8 zone is permitted some form of commercial development. So there's commercial uses in each of these areas that are permitted uses. Then those are further restricted because they're not allocated any commercial density. So it's from a planning perspective, it's almost contradictory. It says you're allowed to undertake this use, but then on the next hand, we're not allocating you any density for this use. So again, it allows for that flexibility. And you'll notice when you go through the CD8 zone that the uses are very specific towards what's permitted in the neighborhood areas and what's permitted in the resort core areas. The neighborhood areas are really geared towards, and I'm just going through the uses right now, and they are noted in the report, local convenience stores, cafes and restaurants, things of that nature, whereas kind of pubs and, equipment repair, those are commercial uses that are geared towards the core areas. So it would allow for some shifting of commercial, but that shifting of commercial outside of the core would be further restricted by what type of uses are actually allowed outside the core.
Follow-up?
Yeah, and so my other question, there, in terms of the density in the table, basically my question is to do with like single family dwelling. So there's some where there's none allowed, and there's some where there's very few, and then there's a couple where there's a lot. So are they allowed to shift? Okay, well, we're going to put 15% in, but it's only going to be single family. So are they going to be able to increase that single family in certain areas?
So through your worship, it would be a maximum of 15% into any one development area. And that would just be the total amount of dwelling units. How they choose to reallocate the type of dwelling units would be, at the request of the proponent. So in theory, if they wanted to shift a portion of single family dwellings out of area 1, which is only allocated 52 single family dwelling units, then they would be permitted to do that, to shift it into, another development area, as long as it's under that 15% cap.
So in theory, they couldn't say, oh, okay, well, there's 900 apartment units, so we're going to take 15% of those units, which is whatever that is, 135, 140, and turn those into single family units in another zone. They can't change the types. It's just, or is it just unit? It doesn't matter what the unit is. They could take those 140 and turn them into a single family unit in another area.
Through your worship, no, the intent isn't to allow for one apartment unit equals 2 single family, or 1 single family dwelling unit equals 4 apartment units, and therefore we're going to take 4 single family, and then that equates to 16 single apartment units. That's not the intent. And the only reason you're getting any not hesitation from me, but I know that there is a reference in here in the zoning bylaw. It's a bit of an obscure reference, but it does speak towards how the dwelling units equate to bed units, which is how they're referred to in the master development agreement. So that's the only thing that I'm just double checking right now. If you give me a minute, I'll be able to get back to you on that one.
Okay.
Thank you. Councilor Ryan, you have another question?
Yeah. Do we know if the CD8 zone allows for vacation rentals?
Through your worship, yes, they do permit vacation rentals with the zone.
So to follow up on your comment, Mr. Sulz, even if there's more densification, I don't think anything about these units is going to be affordable. It's on the doorstep of a golf course, charging hundreds of dollars for a round of golf. So I think the idea of trying to sell this as affordable or more affordable.
Those weren't my words.
No.
This may be benefit to our community.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But I think when we think about what these units are for and who they are for, I don't know that that's really who these are being built for.
Well, and there may be some that'll be multi-million-dollar units, but they may not be they may be right along the golf course, that sort of thing. I'm not going to deny that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Any other comments from council? Councilor Palmer.
So a couple questions. I guess the table on, to start with, just the table on page 3 of your report. So just want to make sure it's clear to me. So is that the existing table? And so what's being proposed? So just looking at the bylaw on page 1. So it says by deleting table 1 and replacing it with the following. So the intent is on the bylaw, so to 1.2.4, you're removing that table in that bylaw? I'm just slightly confused on that.
Through your worship, it would be removing that table and replacing it with the table that's included in the bylaw. The only difference between the two is the addition of the 7th column being the totals column.
Oh, I see. Okay, and then I'm just wondering a few other questions. Through the mayor, so the area 1 and 3, which are adjacent and partially surrounding Williamson Lake, which is a sensitive community asset. I'm wondering if this is an opportunity to open up a discussion of stronger environmental and community protection for Williamson Lake. It's a concern that I think many people in the community, including myself, have. And so is there a potential with the possibility of the zoning amendments to open up that discussion? And especially as it starts to affect density and use, I think it's an important question. So I guess that's the question. Can that dialogue happen?
Through your worship to Councillor Palmer, from a practical planning perspective, I would certainly say that the development permit stage, as individual proposals come in, is the more suitable time to have that conversation. And the only reason that I reference that is because the way the resort area works right now is the entire area is blanketed as not only a forming character development permit area, but a development permit area for protection of the natural environment, as well as protection from environmentally hazardous conditions. So when we would receive a proposal in either one of those areas that's in proximity to Williamson Lake, and we have a little bit more details on what that proposal entails, then we would have the provisions through administration of development permit area guidelines for the protection of the natural environment, including its biodiversity, to issue a development permit with some restrictions on there or with some clauses as it relates to sensitive environmental features in the area.
So then sort of comment to council then is, the concern that I have with leaving that kind of dialogue to the development permit stage is it's a piecemeal approach, and we're missing the big picture about Williamson Lake as to what that community asset and potential opportunities from my perspective. So there's both the environmental, but there's the social impacts, because it's a very important social asset. And so further to Councillor Ryan's comments about, okay, well, who is this really for? At this stage, it's really it's for RMR, quite frankly, that's who it's for. Mm-hmm. And so we need to make sure that we protect the greater community interests. I'm struggling with it a little bit because, I can agree with the idea of flexibility. We've been sort of in the past, a number of years ago now, I guess, but the city was very inflexible, but we should not just give flexibility to a developer where they can just, I know there's still restrictions and you'll make that, but much more, leaving it all in the hands of the developer without that community discussion. And I am focused on Williamson Lake because it's such a precious asset to our community. I'll have further comments, but I see Councillor Chalette is anxious to weigh in. Councillor Chalette.
Aren't we all? It's interesting to have these conversations when we look at the different layers of regulation that affects, especially something as complex as a resort, when it was brought in before most of our time here. Your worship, I imagine you were here during that process, and I've certainly heard stories of what it was like, talking about what might it look like with a world-class resort in this community. Now here we are, how many years later, actually starting to see that come to fruition, and fair enough, there needs to be a bit of flexibility to adjust plans and make it work. My concern is not only with the environmental impacts around Williamson Lake, but also with that drastic of a change of use. From an area that was expected to be a golf course, it's now going to be a neighborhood. That's a big change, especially when it comes to infrastructure, to the effects on the neighbors. From the report, it looks like there will still be restrictions, as Councillor Palmer refers to, at the development permit stage, once more details known. So to me, my understanding is this is just changing the zoning to allow for that density to be shifted. Not, right? Like there's restrictions on how many percentages, but it's an example for more flexibility. It's not details of what this will look like. Is that correct?
Mr. Simon?
Through your worship, yes, that's correct. This is basically getting the zoning bylaw framework for where density can go more in line with those broader, more conceptual plans so that that more detailed planning element can commence.
Right. So if I could ask your worship, what is envisioned as a timeline for these various different pieces? Because I think some of my fellow councillors' concerns around environmental protection and the detail part and the infrastructure, especially when it comes to transparency around infrastructure, might be better suited to this neighborhood planning process that we're talking about. But I'm curious as to what kind of timeline we're looking at with all these various pieces of this work.
Any comment on that, Mr. Simon?
Through your worship, the neighborhood planning process timeline hasn't been applied to it yet. It's something that we would obviously look towards the resort to develop. It's an item that's in the OCP as we want to see these development area guidelines that were established back in 2009 to be updated to reflect where the resort is headed. And then it sets these clear expectations. And then we would understand from the community through this neighborhood planning process, what are the assets that are really, really critical to preserve long-term, like Williamson Lake. Speaking with the resort, our hopes would be that it gets undergoing ASAP. But again, I can't tell you a firm timeline that's been established with it as of yet.
Okay, thank you.
Follow up, Councillor Palmer.
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. Just one more question before I make some more comments. So the total density, the cumulative total density with this change, is it changing the overall potential, or is it just shifting densities?
Through your worship to Councillor Palmer, it is not impacting overall density entitlement. It is only impacting where that density may go, which is exactly as it's specified in the master development agreement with the province.
Yeah, so just sort of carrying on some of the comments then on the, I was trying to put myself in the shoes of the developer in a positive way. And saying, well, where's the opportunity? So this sounds kind of nice. Densities don't change. It's just shifting. They put in where they belong. And with a project this big, that's been going for well over a decade now, approaching 2 decades, there's you expect changes. And those are opportunities for the developer as well. And that's not necessarily bad, but it is opportunities. I can definitely hear the argument a few years from now, if this was to pass, let's increase the density in these areas. That was what was originally envisioned. And so it's an opportunity for increased building and stuff. And even that is not necessarily bad. In that if higher density, and I'm a proponent for higher density where it makes sense. So even reducing the potential density in some of these core areas where it was already identified previously doesn't necessarily make sense for me that we would actually be functionally reducing it. And for sure, I think that the developer in the future, when they see the opportunity, will be coming back to the table. I definitely have a lot of reticence on this. And one of the things that I would like to see, actually, before I go to that, the other impact is further to the conversation about the golf course, where that was going, and there's a lot more history and dynamics that happened about shifting the golf course. For sure, it's where today where it is makes sense in the whole overall business case for the resort. So we have this change, but when we look at zones 5, 4, and 3, that shifting that density is a significant change to how our overall community, going well beyond just the confines of the perception of the resort, which is up on the hill. This is now starting to impact everyday life for many, many people, especially in the Arrow Heights area. So I think this warrants a lot more conversation. I don't see any urgency, and maybe there's a question there. I don't see an urgency on the changes. I don't see that this little change, what is being portrayed as a fairly small change, is something that's holding up development to have that conversation. I think there needs to be more of a conversation. Maybe out to the mayor, if I could just ask that question, is there any immediate, because I don't want to be slowing up the ability for good development. And do they have something that they're wanting to do? They're just itching that they want this particular change. And if they do, is there other options to address those concerns on a more parcel base?
Through your worship to Councillor Palmer, and I think that you were correct in saying that, areas 4 and 5, as stated in the report, those are the areas that probably have the most implications associated with this development. They're the most likely areas that you would see additional development. Area 4 right now is slated to be developed as a driving range because that's what the zoning allows for. And that's what the original plans, when the development permit for the golf course was kind of established, it showed area 4 as a driving range. Now, some might say that it's separated from the rest of the golf course. There's not continuity with the golf course then, and it's an area that has less environmental constraints that is probably more suitable for residential development. So that could be perceived as part of the urgency to get this going so that more comprehensive master planning could occur on those parcels, as opposed to, the resort is underway with the golf course right now, and there will be some conversations about when that driving range needs to get going. And if that's all that the zoning allows for, then that's likely what we're going to end up with at Airport Nickel Way. So that's what's been communicated to me. And to your worship, I haven't forgotten, I do have an answer for Councillor Brooks Hill response whenever you guys have the opportunity. I did find it in the zoning bylaw.
I do have a follow-up question for that, if I may then.
Okay, go for it.
So I just got to make sure I understand. So the driving force is this driving, what was supposed to be a driving range, now they're envisioning higher density in that area. Is that correct?
Through your worship, that is one of the outcomes that could result from this amendment to allow for a shifting of density, is better utilization of the existing space so that we're not having to build into steep slopes or more environmentally sensitive areas for residential development.
Great. Thank you, Mayor Sulz. I'm sometimes a little bit delighted that as a politician, I don't have to use as careful words around conversations. So specifically then on Nickel Road, like there was resistance. I can't remember for sure, but I think possibly from the resort on Mackenzie Village, which also higher density. When we look at this map, this is basically across the street from this, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that it doesn't belong there, but this is such a big impact. And in zone 3 in particular, again, with Williamson Lake, what does that community asset look like? We need to be very, very careful on going ahead. I think there's a couple other council, there's the answer for Michael Brooks Hill, so maybe I'll come back in a minute.
So let's answer your question, Councillor Brooks Hill, and then I'm going to go to Councillor Ryan.
Thank you, worship, to Councillor Brooks Hill. I knew there was something in the zoning bylaw about this. So there is some shifting that's allowed for in the zoning bylaw from use to use. Most of them are a 1-to-1 ratio. So 1 apartment unit for 1 row house could be substituted. And then for single family dwellings, that would equal 1.5 apartment or 1.5 row house units. So a bit of a change, but nothing too substantial.
Okay. Follow up on that?
Well, not a question, but just to show what could happen. So area 4 currently, they're allowed 10 apartment units. In theory, obviously this is highly theoretical. They could shift things around, and by my count, what would that be? That would be 1,000 units if they shifted everything from every possible. No, not 1,000, but it would be hundreds if you take 15% of every other area and put it in to that one.
So just clarification, Mr. Simon, 15% is 15% overall or 15% of what's already allowed in there?
Through your worship, they could reallocate under this amendment 30% of the overall density from area one. Area one's allocated just over 2,700 dwelling units, with no more than 15% going to any one individual development area. So graph, figure number 5 in the report does show a graph of what it would look like for maximum density reallocation within each individual area if that 15% cap was fully reallocated to that individual area.
Can I follow up?
Yes.
So could 15% from area 1 be put in area 4, and then 15% of area 2 be put in area 4? 15% of area 3 into, like, etc.
Through your worship, no. It's only reallocating the base density from area 1 to one of the other 9 different development areas. So you can only take from area 1 and distribute it to other development areas. No other area can have density taken from it under this amendment other than area 1. So you can take from area 1, put in area 2, you can take from area 1, put in area 4, but you can't take from area 9 and put in area 2, only from area 1.
Good, thanks for the clarification, Councillor Ryan.
Okay, so though technically the density would be no change, the allowable density, we've already heard that based on some of this work that's been done, that there's areas that wouldn't be developable. So I think that the feasible density actually does change. And so my question to staff would be, you know, if this is effectively giving RMR the ability to build either cheaper or more units, then, you know, what is in it for the city? Like, do we get CACs? There's a part in the report that mentions that there could be more comprehensive planning, but only potentially. So my other question would be, why only potentially? So I'm just curious, like, this does seem like the flexibility that we don't have to give to the resort, but that we are. So what is the city getting in exchange?
Through your worship, I would look at it in a couple different ways. So from the alternative lens, if there's no flexibility and they are forced to develop what has currently been allocated, we will end up with area 1 hyperdensified, which would be unlike any other area in the city. And it will be a situation where they have 2,742 dwelling units allocated to area 1. And just for reference, right now we have the Sutton place there that is about, I think, 220 units, another 50 some odd single family lots on Monashee and Mackenzie. So we're at about 250 units there. You can imagine the type of buildings that would need to come in to build out in that area at 2,700 units. So we would potentially end up with an area that is hyper-densified. And then the other element of it is, yes, this would, kickstart that neighborhood planning process when there is some flexibility to move some pieces around on the paper, to go out to the community and to work with the resort to say, how is development going to unfold, and what does the resort need from the community, and what does the community need from the resort? And the OCP right now has, I believe, 7 or 8 provisions in there that do specify current obligations from the resort to the community. One of them is a 50% commitment for a social impact assessment, for example, that we've been working with them to try and enable that. So the current framework does have some stipulations in there as to what the resort needs to provide. And I understand this is kind of part of that bigger picture that's a little bit beyond the scope of the proposed text amendment. But they're important considerations to have because it's all part of a bigger, broader planning framework.
Thank you. Follow-up.
Yeah, what triggers the neighborhood plan?
Through your worship, there's no specific reference in the OCP right now that would trigger an update of the plan. But the hope and the expectation is that should we be moving forward with an amendment of this nature, and should we be receiving larger scale development proposal applications from the resort, that we're going to have a bigger idea and a better idea of the big picture. And I know right now the resort has been working with our engineering team to do that master infrastructure planning. And this is envisioned to kind of be the next step of that process. But I can't commit to when the resort would come to the table to initiate this neighborhood planning process.
because in my mind, like yeah, like that, I see the value in that, but if it's not something they're required to do, I don't know why we would just give that, like, to me, it seems like zoning is the card that the city has. And so, once that's been given to them, sure, it's nice to plan it, but then we've given, you know, like, we have nothing else to negotiate with or whatever.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Your Worship, was that for me or for Councillor Charlotte?
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Simon. I'll let you make comment.
Through Your Worship, just one comment that I think is important for council. And when you look at the track changes version and attachment 2, one of the key things here is that any transfers of units or commercial space out of area 1 are also subject to approval by the city. So that's one important element as well. At development permit stage, council still would need to approve under our current delegation bylaw any development permits that are brought forward that are in excess of $100,000, which would be all of them at the resort. And if there was a request to shift density at that stage, it still is subject to approval by the city. So there is still that additional check and balance that the city would need to approve that reallocation of density.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Charlotte and Councillor Palmer.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm curious, in the council options in the report, one of them is talking about deferring consideration pending completion of items that council deems necessary. I think this particular proposal and the experience of learning about the resort development and what the restrictions are will be very useful for the new council to really get to know what one of our major industry partners looks like and how that's being regulated. I'm curious as to whether this master infrastructure planning that Mr. Simon is referring to, if that would be a suitable item that would be required by council before considering this bylaw change.
Mr. Simon.
Through Your Worship, I would actually like to get some insight from Director Black, who I can see is turning on because he's been working with the resort much more closely on all these engineering related matters. So I would defer to him.
Mr. Black.
Thank you, Your Worship, to Councillor Charlotte. The MISPERS, the Master Infrastructure Planning document for the resort, has been underway for a couple of years now. This addresses traffic, water, sewer. So moving density around in the way that's being proposed today is actually the allocation of resources basically stays the same for the resort as a whole. So there may be higher traffic impacts in some locations. However, the overall demand on our systems is comprehensively the same. And so each location would be addressed with moving of those densities around, i.e. traffic impacts and that nature. However, the water, sewer, storm, overall is not going to be changed because the master plan density available to the resort is not changing. I hope that answers your question.
Kind of. It means that maybe not as relevant to this zoning amendment as from what I'm hearing from my fellow councillors is moving this much density around from the resort, knowing how that fits and how the resort density fits into the rest of the city's services might help put minds at ease of making this decision or bringing this decision to the public, because really this does need to go to a public hearing at some point. So bringing that information to the community to say, here, this is what the resort development is going to look like. We're talking about shifting some parts around. Is that okay to put a neighborhood in this area rather than a driving range? But to make that decision in an informed way, knowing what the infrastructure might look like, to me, that's what I'm hearing might be helpful.
Okay, thank you for that comment, Councillor Palmer.
Another question. So the motion on the table, through the mayor, the motion on the table is that zoning amendment bylaw 2346 be read a first time.
Correct.
What is the intent of the next steps? Is this coming back? Is it the intention of the resort and staff for this to be coming back in 2 weeks' time on the last meeting of this council, or is it coming back later on?
It'll come back later on. Mr. Parliament.
Yeah, so to answer that question, when staff met to discuss this text amendment and the staff report, we wrestled with that question. Should we go to first, second reading and then let the new council determine the date of the public hearing? Should we just go to first reading to get it on the table, knowing that there's a lot of questions to be asked? We've heard most of them here today, and that's the path that staff have chosen. So first reading, basically get it on the table. We know that we have to get some answers to some of these questions asked before we go to a public hearing. For example, infrastructure and other. We thought at the staff level, the best path to basically have this issue come before this council prior to the election is first reading only. At any time, the new council can introduce second reading, only to the satisfaction that most of those questions have been answered before we go to the public, for the public hearing. So it's in fairness to both RMR that we get it on the table, because it is a request. It's not changing the overall density. We now know you can't take no more than 30% out of area 1. You cannot allocate no more than 15% to any other area. But we thought at the staff level, there are safeguards also included in the text amendment, and that is the section 123 saying it's any environmental or physical constraints would reduce that density, and also that the city and the MDA would have to be approved. So we thought at the staff level, and also being consistent with the OCP, let's just get first reading on the table. Thank you.
Follow question to that. When did RMR put the application for this change, this amendment to the bylaw? When was that brought forward? I'm not sure who that's going to.
Mr. Sullivan?
Through your worship, I can tell you the exact date. It was in August this year, but that being said, staff have been working with them on this application, kind of behind the scenes. That's at pre-application stage for a couple of months before that. I believe it was the beginning of August when the application was submitted.
Thank you for that. And I'm glad to hear that, because having more time, we bring stuff back to council. At the same time, I don't see this as an urgent thing. What I would like to see is RMR in this room, and then we're having a discussion of where we're going as a community.
You already have them here.
Okay?
Yeah.
The applicant, but I mean the principals as well,
The owner's representative.
Yeah, understood. There's a lot of players with RMR, so thank you, Mayor, for opening that up. But I really think that, and I respect, the owner's representative, I understand that. There's other players here on RMR. It's a big entity, and there's a lot of dynamics as to how we evolve as a community. And this is really, really sensitive. We've had this on for a long time. So that's ideally what I would like to see. At the same time, further to the CAO's comments, about, okay, well, this is first reading, so there's ample opportunity for massaging. I'm really concerned, though, about that we're missing the big picture, that we're missing council, not necessarily RMR, but we're missing to make sure that we're looking after the interests of the community as a whole. There's been lots of dialogue about the loss of green spaces, the impact of densification on a more ad hoc basis. Williamson Lake is a super sensitive issue. And when you look at the surrounding here and what that might look like in the future, we might get it wrong, and it might not even be in the resort's overall interest. So that's really what I would like to see. And then further to Councillor Charlette's comments about council options. And just for clarity, it's just a typo, but you have option 1, and option 2. So can we call the second option 1, option 2, and the option 2, option 3? Something like that? Is that just more? It's just because it does make a difference. So the second option 1, I think that's I'm sort of sensing that's where, this sort of deferral, but we don't want to hold up good development. It's important to get inventory, even if it's ultra expensive, it's more inventory in the market.
Correct.
But I would really like to see that. I would certainly consider that deferral, before this first reading. I'd be fine with the first reading less. I prefer to have that discussion. And then the other thing is, with the new council coming in, at the very minimum, Mayor Sulz or possibly Councillor Charlotte, you're going to have 4 brand new absolutely brand new counselors. And this is a really good thing for them to just put their teeth in a big way, understanding what's happening in the community, because there's tough decisions. There's lots of sort of political rhetoric about various things, including Airbnbs and such. I think that discussion, and that's going to happen regardless. But that would really be my preference, is to even hold off on the first reading until they've had that dialogue, to make sure that we have a full dialogue. So that's kind of my comments. And if there was another councillor that was wanting to entertain the second option, we'd have to figure out exactly how we're going to word that as an amendment. But that would be my preference. Okay. But it's not the end of the world if we stick with what we've got.
Okay. I'd like to see the first reading be done because it's on the table. Staff have given serious consideration to this, and I look forward to that. And it still allows the new council robust discussion on that sort of thing. Councillor Ryan, do you have your hand up?
What happens if this doesn't go to first reading and gets voted down?
So through your worship to Councillor Ryan, I obviously can't speak for the development proponent on how their plans would be changed. What I can speak towards is best planning practices. We would be looking at an approval framework that is quite rigid, that arguably doesn't align with the intent of the master development agreement that the province issued, and arguably doesn't align with our own official community plan. We would be looking at trying to squeeze development, practically speaking, into an area that would potentially be hyperdense, which means encroaching into more environmentally hazardous areas, encroaching into more environmentally sensitive areas. And, in my view, probably ultimately results in the developer coming back to the table, asking for variances for things like height, so that they can build at the density that they've been entitled to based on their master development agreement with the province. That would be, I guess, my concern from the planning perspective, that we would be squeezing density into an area that may not be suitable for it, rather than dispersing it amongst a multitude of resort lands. And I can appreciate the challenge with the resort kind of bordering Arrow Heights on the east, a little bit on the north and on the south. But this is a different neighborhood. It is a resort neighborhood as outlined in our official community plan. And as such, it does get different consideration than the surrounding neighborhood, but it still needs to be compatible with the surrounding neighborhood.
Follow up, Councillor Ryan, and then
Yeah,
Councillor Brooks.
I guess I just, when you say it that way, I don't feel like the rigid plan is such a bad thing, because, we have to remind ourselves that we're just talking about vacation rentals here. That's it, will there be people that buy and live there? Sure, there's going to be a handful of those, but these are by and large going to be second homes and whatever. And so, I just don't see the urgency and why we should be giving such flexibility without the resort having a detailed plan first. It seems like that should come before we give the approval.
Okay, Councillor Brooks, did you have your hand up?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Yeah, my feeling about this is, I can see the benefits. I can definitely see the benefits to the resort from this. I see why they want it. To me, it probably means tens of millions of dollars to them over the long term, if not hundreds. And so it's an obvious benefit. There's, I do understand, as Mr. Simon states, there are obvious benefits to Revelstoke as well. Having the resort do well is a benefit to Revelstoke. On the converse side of that, having the resort do well has brought a lot of problems to Revelstoke. And a lot of people in town, their feeling is initially the city gave the resort too good a deal. They are making a lot of money here and they're causing problems in town. They've helped a lot of people. It's a symbiotic relationship. Ideally, we want both to thrive. That is what the city wants, and I assume it's what RMR wants. But essentially, they're a business and they want to make money. That's their number one driving force. And our job is to look out for the best interests of the city. And to me, looking at this, the weight of it is it's benefiting the resort and it's marginally benefiting the city, maybe. You know, as Councillor Ryan says, I do see the benefits to just keeping the resort in a dense area. That there are benefits to that. And so at the end of the day, I'm not running for council. I'm not going to be the one making this decision. That's the fact. And so I'm not, it's a hard decision to make because, you know, I would like to ask for more from the resort, but at the end of the day, I'm not the one who's going to make the decision. So I don't even know what to ask for because whoever's sitting around this table is going to either say yes or no or have different desires. And to ask the resort for something when I'm not the one who's making the decision doesn't seem fair to them. Wasted work is wasted work. It doesn't benefit anyone. That's just a waste. So I'm not sure how I feel. In some ways, I like the idea of just deferring first reading so that then the new council can sit down here and say what is worth asking for, what is the benefits. On the other hand, granting first reading doesn't really do much. At the same time, the new council can still come back and ask for things before second reading. So,
Councillor,
I would say granting first reading demonstrates that we're open for an opportunity. I would suggest if you don't feel, when you weigh out the benefits of having a resort here versus not, you should go back to 20 years ago when we didn't have a resort here and in play. And they were begging to have that, you know, something to happen to our town. So I would disagree with you on whether the benefits are, I mean, sure, there are problems. There are always problems with growth and change. But ask around, if they don't feel, the community doesn't feel it's more beneficial to have it, then I'd say that question needs to be asked to the broader public than just yourself or the people that you might know. I would also say for the, we need a supply of housing, and whether it's elite housing or high-end housing, it doesn't matter. We need housing, and that will translate down to the other end. And I would say all the other development in Narrow Heights, Mackenzie Landing, all those different places that have cramped the resort. I mean, initially the federal, provincial government gave the resort as much flexibility to build something that would make sense. You know, they could move the cards, as Nicole mentioned, to suit the environment, to suit the market, to suit, you know, to make it sensible to them to develop. And we bid into that, and we said, this is what we want. We gave it to you. So now we're cramping this out and taking away that flexibility by restricting them or putting it aside. Just similar to what we did in Johnson Heights. 6 years ago, the guy from Johnson Heights put a plan on the table. We got the first reading last week or a third reading and we deferred it. So that demonstrates something's wrong with the process. And I don't want to continue it. I think we should go out of our way to make a change and make things happen.
your comment, Councilor.
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. I'm going to propose an amendment to the motion on the table. So reading just as it is, the zoning amendment bylaw 2346 be read a first time, and that a committee of whole with the RMR team be held prior to consideration of second reading. So that's an amendment to the motion. I'll speak to it if I get a seconder to the amendment.
Okay, someone want to second that motion? Councilor Brooks-Feld, speak to that.
Okay, so again, what it reads is that a committee of the whole meeting with the RMR team be held prior to consideration of second reading. I'm seeing this as, you know, making sure that we keep moving along. I agree with Councillor Elliott about making sure we have good processes and timeliness, but we also have a duty to our community, making sure we have really good dialogue. And so this just will be that opportunity with the new council coming in to have that face-to-face dialogue, yes, with you, but also the team. And I've left it a bit ambiguous as to what the team means.
Thank you.
I think RMR will understand that. and really we'll have that good dialogue with the incoming council. And I see this as a positive in that, again, we're going to have a number of new players, and there's going to be different philosophical or ideological ideas that are brought to the table. And I think this will really help to have that face-to-face conversation. And yet we still have that first reading on the table.
Great. Comment, Councillor Charlotte, you have a comment on the amendment?
I do. I'm in support of this. I had something similar jotted down. I would like to check through your worship to the corporate officer that the motion's written in a functional way that would move.
Ms. Floyd, comment on the motion, the amended motion as read.
Your worship, the motion that Councillor Palmer, the amending motion was, and that committee of the whole and RMR and the RMR team be held prior to consideration of second reading.
And is that process legal?
It is, yes. So you will call the question on the amendment, and then you'll call the question on the entire thing as amended.
Thank you. Any other comments on the amended motion, Councillor Elliott?
So is council getting involved with the planning world? With that recommendation? Are we getting involved in what the planner does?
Yes and no. And in my mind.
Yeah, in my mind you do,
and
but they're doing the work, we're doing the work.
So do you want me to respond or and so I'm hearing what Councillor Palmer is asking. He's asking to hear directly from the developer the concerns the community has based on what council is proposing to the developer, hearing from the public, to have that, to basically have a better understanding in his mind as to what we should be doing for the community. So being able to ask those questions is what he's asking for. Is that correct, Councillor Palmer?
Yeah, if I may, Mr. Sulz, council has a role, staff has a role. I am not asking for us to be, when we're meeting with them, to be the planners. We've got good staff that can look after that, and we shouldn't get involved with that. We are the decision makers. We're elected on behalf of the community to be the visionaries for our community. Where is our community going? We've also talked about communications. I think there's always room for better communications, including at this table with, key economic drivers in our community. And I think that can be very helpful as we move ahead. And so, and I'll also state that, there's been some criticism of the public hearing process. It's very stilted, and this is just allowing an opportunity before that public hearing to make sure that we understand and can ask a lot of, those hard visionary questions on behalf of the community. And that's why I would like to see this.
Okay, thank you for that comment.
But
Councillor.
normally, the way our democratic process works and our public hearings and all that was meant to be asked those hard questions. We're supposed to get to the public hearing, hear what the audience or the community says, and bring it back and make a decision. That's the process. Now we're coming to the council, give us an insight, and then we'll go to the public hearing. That's a deviation from the process.
Okay, thanks for the comment, Councillor Charlotte.
Thank you, Your Worship. The reason why I support this amendment, and what I was thinking of when I was jotting down a similar conversation, is that the next council, as Councillor Palmer says, is going to have to make a decision on this. The way RMR is regulated in our community is complicated. It's hard to understand all the different layers of bylaws and guidelines and development permits of how it's decided what they can and cannot do on resort grounds to benefit our community and to continue to develop. With a committee of the whole conversation that, in my mind, would be a tour of those regulatory pieces and how this zoning bylaw, the zoning amendment fits into that picture, is what that meeting could be. More of a workshop style, just to understand, ask questions, get some feedback from some of the questions we've asked today, and more information on the infrastructure plans, so that then when it comes to second reading in a council meeting, it's not a half-hour conversation like we're having right now. That brainstorming, that open dialogue can happen beforehand, and then the second reading can present, okay, this is what's going to public hearing that then goes out to the community. But because it's in a committee of the whole meeting, that would also be on YouTube and visible to the community to be able to participate in that conversation.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments on the amendment on the table? Councillor Ryan.
I'm not in favor of the original bylaw amendment and would prefer to vote against that than to vote on the amendment. So I will probably vote against this, but I'm kind of questioning that. So any comments?
So through the mayor to Councillor Ronnie. So I would suggest that you vote in favor of the amendment, and if you still don't like it, vote against the overall motion. If you think the
Because
motion,
we have to do that after.
yeah, because if you think the motion is better with the amendment, vote in favor of the amendment. If you think it's worse with the amendment,
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yes.
because it might
yeah.
pass.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
And so I'm going to support the amendment and the overall first reading because I think it's important for us to move this forward. I think this is a benefit to our community. The nuts and bolts of things we can work out as we move along. But, you know, what I'm saying to the community is I think at this point in time, we've had RMR here for 10 years. We need to work with them. They need to work with us. We need to come up with a plan to move the community forward and RMR forward in a way that's going to work for everybody. Having this conversation is going to be a benefit. So that's my thing. So any other questions or comments on the amendment? Seeing none, I'll call the question on the amendment. All those in favor? Opposed? Note that Councillor Elliott is opposed to the amendment. Balance of council is in favor. Now, I'm going to go back to the original motion that zoning amendment bylaw number 2346 be read first time as amended. So you have a comment on that?
Yes. So to Councillor Elliott's point about the type of housing not mattering, I think that that's not true. This isn't a development of homes that would be purchased and rented in on a long-term basis. This is vacation rentals, and we need to call it what it is.
Jackie, there's 1,500 vacation rentals going across the street.
Yeah, but it's
So,
not.
and the resort is built on,
It's not as if they don't have flexibility right now. This is giving them additional flexibility that once you give it to them, it's way more difficult for a council.
which is going to
Let me
most
finish.
benefit the community.
It's way more difficult.
Just finish.
It's way more difficult if we give this flexibility for a council down the road to say no to any kind of development permit, right?
We have.
You
that's
can't
not-
deny that, right? Like it's, once you give it something,
Ultimately,
it's, you
council
can't
will
take it
decide
back.
whether they approve the development permit, whatever comes at their way.
Absolutely.
So what individually they will
Mayor
come.
Sulz, point of order, I'm getting
Yeah.
confused.
So I'm going to go back to the original motion. Do you have some comment on
I
that?
do, yeah.
Okay, so
So
finish
my
your comment.
point is that once this flexibility gets given to the resort, then any subsequent development permits, even though they have to come back to council, they're much more difficult for that new council to say no to. And so, you know, to your point about the nuts and bolts can be sort of figured out in the future. I don't know why we wouldn't make sure that that plan is consistent with what we want before we say yes to it. When we are talking about vacation rentals, this isn't about bending over backwards for some affordable development, housing development that's going to be great. Like I personally, you know, I think our role is to look out for the best interest of the community, and I don't think that this is in the best interest of the community.
Okay, so thank you for that comment. And I'm just going to go back to your comment where it's, we have the ability now with the amended motion on the table to have that robust conversation with RMR at the committee of the whole table to ask the questions that you're concerned about. So I think we can deal with that sort of thing. That's my feeling anyway. You have a comment that you want to,
I would say if you're going to any development in a resort complex, vacation rentals, you would put it into the guys who are most likely to put the money, or though everyone else is here to draw. You build the attraction, build the entity that's drawing people to your other, and they fall off, you know, all the others benefit as well. But if you're jeopardizing the core to support the 1,500 vacation rentals that are currently in place, you're missing the boat, right? Because you should be drawing into the core business first.
okay, thank you for your comment. You have a follow-up, and then Councilor Brooks Hill, and then I'm gonna ask one more time if there's follow-up, and then we're gonna call a question.
At our last council meeting, you made a great point about incentivizing the right types of development, stating exactly what we want, and then giving people the flexibility, developers the flexibility to build those units with less red tape. This is exactly not that.
We could say to them, okay, if you want vacation rental, 20% of them will have to be permanent resident. You could say that.
You could say that, that's not what
But
we're
that's
talking
when
about
they
right now.
come in, but no, that's.
Well, we're not at that point right now, so, anything further, Councilor Ryan?
No, because
Okay.
once we've done this, there is literally nothing, there are no chips, we're giving them our chips. I don't know, this seems like so clear to
Jackie,
me.
how can you say that?
Councilor Brooks Hill, do you have a
I
comment?
don't run
You did.
No, I didn't.
So I will vote in favor of the motion, however, I disagree with. I'm much closer to Councillor Ryan. I do see that this is a benefit to the community, however, it's like, I would say it's a tiny benefit to the community and a huge benefit to RMR. And I would like to see the scales tip closer into a benefit to both. I think we should be asking for a lot to grant them this.
Well, you're gonna have that opportunity, or council will have that opportunity.
That is why I will vote in favor.
All right. Councilor Sherlock, do you have any last words? Okay, Councilor Elliott, any last words?
I'm just, what are we voting on right now?
You were voting on the amendment to zoning amendment bylaw number 2346 be read a first time. And that's amended with going to committee of the whole, correct, Ms. Floyd?
That's correct.
Yes, correct. Now, Councilor Palmer.
Just, Fusion, can we have the corporate officer read the entire motion as amended?
For sure. So that zoning amendment bylaw number 2346 be read a first time, and that committee of the whole be scheduled with the RMR team held prior to consideration of third reading.
Second reading.
Sorry, second reading.
All right. No other comments? I will call the question on the amended motion. All those in favor? Opposed? Note Councilor Ryan is opposed. Balance of council in favor. This motion is carried. All right, let's carry on to 11A staff reports, resort development strategy. Someone want to put this motion on the table, and I'll have Ms. Braun weigh in. Councilor Palmer.
That the Resort Development Strategy 2022-2024 be approved and the Director of Community Economic Development be authorized to make minor revisions as requested by the Ministry of Tourism, Arts and Culture, and the Chief Administrative Officer be authorized to sign a contribution agreement with the Ministry of Tourism, Arts and Culture.
Seconder for the motion, please. Councilor Sherlatt. Discussion on this motion. So Ms. Braun, I will ask you to give a brief presentation if you have one.
To your worship, I don't have a full presentation. We've discussed this report a number of times, or this actual strategy a number of times. I can point out the main changes are based on input received from the Ministry of Tourism and following a meeting with our other colleagues at the resort communities back in June in Rossland. And so we've worked with our tourism committee and with with senior staff to make sure that this aligns with their capital projects and sets us up for success with how we're going to reallocate funds that are available to us carried over from last year. So I can take any questions if there are any.
Any questions, Councilor Palmer?
So the second part of this motion about the minor amendments as requested by the Ministry of Tourism, Arts and Culture, will those amendments be reported back to council? I'm always have a little bit of a hesitation of just sort of an open-ended authorization. So if you could just lay my fears.
Through your worship. Yes, I mean, I think what we find is that it'll go to the ministry and they may come back with some small changes regarding performance indicators, for instance, or performance measurements. And some of those smaller changes, we have to kind of go back and forth. There's a lot of back and forth with the resort development strategy. As you know, it's been to the committee 4 times, it's been to council 3 times, and we haven't had the final word on the ministry. They're reviewing our final version now, the one that's in front of you, and they may come back with some smaller changes, but I haven't seen anything as of yet, but certainly we'll share them with council.
Follow-up, Council.
That's good.
Okay. Any other questions or comments from other councillors? Seeing none, I'll call a question. All those in favor? Opposed? No, motion's carried. Thank you. Moving on to item 11B, active transportation infrastructure application. Someone want to put that motion on the table for me, Councillor Palmer?
That the submission for the BC Active Transportation Infrastructure Grant application for a multi-use pathway on Nickel Road from Park Drive to Airport Way be supported.
Okay, seconder for that motion. Councillor Gillette, any discussion on that motion? Any comment, Mr. Black?
Through your worship, Engineer Ms. Bridge is available to do a very, very short presentation if that's suitable for council.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Good afternoon, Your Worship and councillors. I'm going to present the BC Active Transportation Infrastructure Grant application for 2022/2023. The City of Revelstoke Engineering Department has prepared an application for the 2022 and 2023 BC Active Transportation Infrastructure Grant Program. This grant must be submitted by October 22nd of 2022. It will provide recipients of population under 15,000, like Revelstoke, with a lesser of up to 70% project funding or $500,000. The project is a connecting piece between two sections of multi-use pathway, we call MUP, on Airport Way, seen in red here, and also another section in red that's being constructed right now along Nickel. This is important connecting piece between the two, and it's also going to be an important connecting piece of the whole multi-use pathway that will go from downtown Revelstoke to RMR and then eventually to Williamson Lake. This project is in conjunction with RMR and the Little Shuswap First Nations. This multi-use pathway will be a 3-meter wide pathway with crosswalks, driveway crossings, drainage solutions, lighting, and asphalt pathway. It'll be an asphalt pathway. Here is a drawing from our consultant Lawson Engineering. You could see this is a section from Airport Way and it's going to go towards Park. It's just cut off a little bit shorter here, but the 3-meter path is represented in gray. Green is the drainage solutions, and you can see the driveway crossings as well as a crosswalk here at Airport Way that will connect the Airport Way multi-use pathway. The grant is estimated to pay for $410,000, which will be assuming that we receive a 70% of a 70% contribution. The total estimated cost is $585,000, and this was also provided by Lawson Engineering. City contribution will then be $175,000. Thank you, and do you have any questions?
Palmer, did you have your hand up prior to the presentation?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Sulz, and thank you, Ms. Bridge, and thank you for the backdrop of your active transportation. Much appreciated. Yeah, I'm just excited that we're making movement on alternate transportation modes for our community. There's a high demand for that. I know there's the odd naysayer out there, but generally our community is very much into active transportation, and so I certainly appreciate this, and I'm glad that we're seeking more funding sources to create this infrastructure. And I do note in your report through the mayor about Williamson Lake, I also noticed an absence of some of the diagram of the connectivity for Williamson Lake. That's not part of the discussion here, but it ties to our previous discussion in understanding how multi-purpose happens and that huge asset that we have in Williamson Lake. I think it's an opportunity for RMR, quite frankly, and to help the community move more so into active communication, active transport corridors, including directly to Williamson Lake. Thank you, Mayor Sulz.
Thank you. Any other comments, Councillor Elliott?
So the Airport Way connector, is that, how's that going, Stephen? Sorry. Avery?
Through your worship to Councillor Elliott. So the airport way map from McKinnon to Nickel,
Yes.
we've just got a little bit of bollard work and safety signage to put up, and it's ready to go. People are using it. It's not technically open, but people are using it, and it seems to be a very nice facility for the community, and we're very pleased to see that happen. We will be complete before the snow falls, and our public works crews are going to have to figure out how to maintain this now in the winter. And so we're adding a whole bunch of infrastructure to the community, which is very, very important. And we're very fortunate that, as Councillor Palmer mentioned, that we do have a very active community. And by continuing to add infrastructure in this way, we can be relatively certain that we will not need to enhance the road network for vehicles. So I'm very pleased to bring this project forward with the help of staff. And if we're successful, we will have a network that goes from downtown to the resort and eventually down to Williamson Lake. And as Councillor Palmer also mentioned, we'll be working with the mountain to extend that multi-use path along airport, hopefully over Red Devil Hill and all the way down to Williamson, and create a nice usable network for our residents and the tourists and our guests.
Go ahead, Councillor.
So there were two grants. There was another grant that was going down towards Nickel, towards the school.
So we have the multi-use path on Nickel, which is also underway, which is on the south side of Nickel, and that goes from Park up to the new roundabout in front of Mackenzie Village. This piece is from Park to Airport that Avery has presented today. And then we have the grant that built that portion of on Airport Way. So that was $500,000 for the Airport Way piece, almost $1 million for the Nickel Park to roundabout piece. And we'll have this other, if we're successful, another roughly 500,000 for that last little piece between Park and Airport. And then we've got the school safety program, which will come through the budgeting process and the borrowing with the through the province to construct improvements in front of Arrow Heights School and Columbia Park schools, which will be next year's projects.
And then the connector to the resort, from the roundabout to the resort. Now, is that on the schedule, or when does that hope to be implemented?
Through your worship to Councillor Elliott, I met with the resort development folks this morning, and Camosi realignment drawings are being revised at this time, and that work will be undertaken either in concurrently with the realignment of Camosi for the golf course, or following the realignment of Camosi. And so I expect to see that completed in the next couple of years.
And then they from the resort down to Williamson's Lake, that's resort land that's on the fringe, right? And it would be a resort contribution to the network.
That is part of the Valley Trail plan. Timing and financing has not been yet completely determined.
Right. Okay.
And but it is coming.
Yeah, and then the one bottleneck is the Illicilluit Bridge. What for the trail network? What are you thinking?
So we've got a really good mode shift for cycling and active transportation now. We need to improve our road systems to allow better facilities for that mode shift to even get greater. The bridge itself is either going to have a cantilevered multi-use path, or in a perfect world, I would suggest rebuilding the whole thing and actually putting two full multi-use paths on either side of that bridge, and making sure that it's adequate in height for, and we'll need another 100 years out of it. So these bridges need to be replaced soon. So there is a cost associated with that, and that will be coming forward as a recommendation in the Transportation Master Plan.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions on the motion on the table? Seeing none, I will call the question. All those in favor? Motion's carried. Thank you. Moving on to item.
I'd like to make a motion for a short recess.
Okay, is there a second for that motion? Councillor Ryan. Okay, so Ms. Rousseau, if you could put up the sign, or Ms. Floyd, we're going to take a brief recess. Thank you.
Sure. Is that one cigarette? How many minutes? Short. Definition of short.
Can you please mute the room?
Matter, if you don't mind.
I mean,
So, Ms. Rousseau, are we ready?
We're ready, Your Worship.
All right, so let's deal with 11C, Development Approvals Process Modernization Summary Report. Someone want to put the motion on the table, and then I believe we have a presentation. Councilor Brooks, Hill.
That the implementation of the following UBCM development approvals process review grant fundable recommendations as in the package.
All right. Second for that motion, Councilor Charlotte. Mr. Simon, we have Ms. Henderson here is ready to do presentation. Is that correct?
Yes, Your Worship. This is Ms. Henderson, who is a senior local government advisor with Urban Systems, who has been invaluable to our team and helping support us on a variety of initiatives. So I will pass it over to her for a brief presentation.
All right, Ms. Henderson, take it away.
All right, good afternoon, Mayor and Council. Thank you for having me back. I am just going to share my screen with you so you can see I have a brief presentation for you and happy to take any questions you might have. Okay, can you see that okay?
Ken, thank you.
Okay, perfect. All right. So this afternoon, I'll just quickly go over some of the project background, including the provincial context and some recent changes to provincial legislation. Go over the grant funding scope. This is a very exciting project because most of it is funded through the UBCM. We did a significant amount of engagement associated with this review, and so we'll share with you sort of the highlights of what we heard, and then get into some of the recommendation categories. We started sort of finding natural categories where some of the recommendations fit into, and then the prioritized actions and sort of the timeline associated with those, and then the recommendation, which sort of outlines the next steps as well. So in terms of the background, this is a grant funded process. The city was extremely successful to get close to $400,000 from UBCM. There was $13 million that was handed out across the province, and definitely a very significant chunk of that went to Revelstoke, which is fantastic. The process is basically there's an underlying principles of the grant, which is really working towards increasing the housing supply, and the thinking that increasing the housing supply and putting more housing on the market faster is strongly related to timing of the approval process and providing opportunities to streamline. And that's why the province really funded this initiative. So really looking towards sort of common principles, including efficiency, cost effectiveness, transparency, and also just ease of use regarding the terms and nature of development approvals. The province, to sort of kick this off before they provided the funding, completed their own provincial review of the development approvals process. And what they found was that there's several challenges that are quite consistent across the municipality. So I know council spends quite a bit of time, hearing from applicants that might be unhappy with timelines or back and forth with municipal staff, but a lot of that is quite consistent across the province. So some of the things that they found is internally incomplete applications from the development community really take a lot of time, put a lot of burden on municipal staff, and that was quite universal. So those that were collecting and making sure through the intake process that the applications are really complete, generally were more efficient in processing them. There's some inconsistencies, and that often is like development permit guidelines, but I would say that there's inconsistencies or interpretation issues in many bylaws. And when that takes place, there's a lot of time around decision making that could be streamlined if those were clarified. And over time as well, there's a lot more complexity to bylaws, development applications, layers of approvals, the role of local government. So everything has got much more complex. You add in climate change mitigation, and so on. So this is sort of a universal thing that's happening across the province. And then there's some concern, which often happens, you get contradictory advice from different departments. And, you know, sort of some of the nature of the process where you've got one department that might be taking care of a lot of the process, and then they're getting a certain way through the process, and then another department enters the scene and has concerns. This is something that goes on, and I think there's some suggestions in our recommendations to sort of try to limit the occurrence of what the development community often considers like changing the goalposts late in the game. And then externally, some of the comments received from the development community was just sort of a feeling of lack of transparency on what was happening with applications, and that there is a desire for more consistency across the province or between local governments, especially when you have you know, consultants and agents working across many municipalities in a close area with very different regulations in each. They find that quite frustrating. So the province responded to some of these concerns with some new legislation that was brought into force last November. And the Bill 26 is what the statute was called, so it's often referred to the Bill 26 changes. But there is a significant change in terms of public hearings, and I was hearing council refer to the public hearing process earlier in the meeting. But there's now a removal of the default requirement to hold public hearings for zoning bylaw amendments that are consistent with the official community plan. So any official community plan amendments would be sort of default into a public hearing requirement. But when the community has an application for a zoning bylaw that's consistent with the OCP, there's no requirement to have a public hearing. However, there's a whole other process associated with that, which includes sending out a notification prior to first reading, and then council could always opt in to a public hearing if they feel it's controversial. So these are things that the municipality may wish to consider implementing through the next phases of this project. The other one, tends to be quite a bit of streamlining, or, you know, it's time savings associated with delegating a certain approvals to staff, and, you know, not having to write the council report and wait for a council agenda and appear before council and so on, often saves at least a month and maybe longer in many situations. So the province has also provided a provision to delegate minor development variance permits to staff. So that's something else that council could consider, and that they must basically set up criteria and guidelines to guide the decision of delegation. So it would require a bylaw amendment and further consideration of council. But these are some new tools that I just wanted to bring forward to council. So as you're considering the recommendations of the report, these are new legislation that I thought you should be aware of. In terms of the development process review and the document, the big chunky document that's attached to your council report, just a sort of a brief sort of approach and methodology that we took. I know I met with many of you. It was winter last year, so you know what have we been doing, and what did that kind of look like? So we had a background and document review. So we were looking at, you know, a lot of your policy documents and zoning bylaws, and all the way down to delegation bylaws, your APC bylaw, you know, your zoning bylaw, subdivision servicing bylaw. We had quite a significant review, and then kind of started mapping out sort of the local context. And then we met with council staff and the development community. We sent out a survey to numerous applicants, and also interviewed 4 developers. We certainly gave the opportunity for more. Anyone who wanted an interview could request it, but we had 4 meetings, and we also met with like a very large component of the RMR team as well. So it wasn't just one person, it was a handful of people at RMR. And so we took all that information, and it certainly had a big part in the development of this report and the recommendations, and really helped us understand the context in Revelstoke. And your planning staff have also invited me to several pre-application meetings, just as an observer, where I'm hearing like how staff's interacting, and the nature of the applications and the level of detail that's coming before staff as well, which is really helpful. And then from there, we drafted a summary outlining the findings of the engagement and background review, which is quite a significant component of the report before you, and then developed recommendations for process improvements and streamlining activities. I think it's important to note too that, this is a process review. So our focus is really on the nuts and bolts of the process and not like an assessment of the people or staff, although there are some components in there where we talked about just some comparison to other municipalities of similar size and observations that we made. But really the focus of this was sort of on the process itself. So in terms of, I mentioned who we talked to, we met with the mayor and 3 councillors. The development community, we had 13 survey respondents, but we sent the survey out to at least 30 in the development community. And then we had several meetings with staff and also attended a manager's meeting as well. And so what we heard from that, and you'll see this through the report, it laid out in quite a bit of detail, but there's certainly a feeling that there's opportunities, and this has been identified, by numerous stakeholders, and staff is certainly well aware and have made several attempts in the last several months. So you've got to think that the survey we did was last February, and staff have also been working on improvements since then. But website and communication, like self-serve options, clear guides, opportunities for people to do some of their own homework in an easily understandable way and sort of understand the requirements, need for more clarity of those requirements and the timing of those conditions, because something like a zoning application, for example, some of the timing might be a condition of adoption, not before they go to first reading. So indicating to applicants when certain conditions need to be provided. GIS improvements would be one area that the city is certainly building on, and there's been quite a bit of funding to improve GIS. But from the development services perspective, there's a lot more that can be done, and many municipalities are now moving more into like digital information rather than paper-based information. And there's amazing tools associated with that. So that was one area that would really speed up the review process if it was more at staff's fingertips. And then I think in terms of, I know the city has completed a number of master plans of late, which are really identifying, the infrastructure needs of the community. But when you have certain areas in the community that don't have that infrastructure in place and don't necessarily have a financial plan to be able to put that in place, or even whose responsibility is it to put that in place? Is it the applicants, the developers, or the municipalities? So that slows down the process in itself. And then it's really important too, just to standardize the internal procedures. The city has seen over the last 10 years, like quite a bit of turnover with different planners and staff coming in with their own visions on how things should be done. But it'd be really helpful to have sort of standardized procedures that are the city's procedures, and whoever's sitting in the chair or whoever that staff person is reviewing the file is doing so in exactly the same process and same way. There's also opportunities to delegate to staff, and I mentioned the minor variance, new legislation to be able to delegate minor variances to staff, but opportunities to even expand development permits. Right now, the city is delegating minor development permits that have a value of $100,000 for forming character, which is it's a 20-odd-year-old bylaw. So, I mean, $100,000 nowadays is not very much. So there's certainly opportunities to expand forming character delegation, as well as most municipalities are delegating technical development permits, such as like hazardous conditions and environmentally sensitive to staff. So there'd be opportunities for streamlining there. I think all municipalities are really starting to see internal priorities for staff time, like competition for, if you're working on the OCP, it's hard to juggle the OCP and current applications. And so, you look at specialization of tasks, or if council has a project for staff, it's just really important to kind of factor in how that's affecting staff's timeline and ability to move applications forward. And then in terms of training capacity building of staff, retention, like how do we keep staff in Revelstoke? How do we continue to build capacity and make sure that there's a lack of redundancy in tasks across the organization, and that's something that's, I think, really important in this current job market in all municipalities. One thing we noted that the city does have rather complex bylaws, and dated. Many of them are dated, but more complex than other municipalities of similar size, and that would be something that could also help streamline the process if they were just maybe a little easier to understand. And then some of the requirements that the city is asking for, the return on investment, is there another way of doing it that would be simpler for all involved? I think we have some ideas around that. And then opportunities just to have more templates and automation and IT solutions. And a big chunk of this grant was earmarked towards IT solutions, which could be the GIS improvements I was talking about, but also like some software efficiencies just to try to automate some of the process, as well as like online submissions. The development community identified they'd like to, be able to track or know where the status of their application is. And there's all kinds of opportunities for improvements there. But it's really important that before you, purchase the software is not going to solve the problems. You have to have the processes like mapped out and standardized, and then the software can help you out. But some municipalities have bought the software, but if the processes aren't really mapped out, it's a very laborious and often a failing process. So there's definitely some order of events to consider. And then just in terms of like clarity of roles, and there's a lot of times that, the applicant has roles in the process and often are complaining about the timeline it takes staff to process applications. But many times it's also they're waiting on information that is required to process that application. But at the same time, could staff, maybe communicate those outstanding requirements a bit different? And then, of course, council's role as a decision maker, and making sure that's really clear. And especially when you have a new council coming in, it's a lot. Like there's a lot of legislation and a lot of processes. It's a big part of your agenda. I know there's quite a bit after me tonight. So just making sure those rules are really clear is really important. And then in terms of the actions that are outlined in the report, with this grant, all the grant funded items need to be completed by August 15th, 2023. So there's a lot of work to do over the next sort of 10 months. So the ones that are grant funded are the priority recommendations in the report, and that's solely reflecting the timeline associated with the funding. And then there's some medium-term recommendations as well that weren't necessarily grant funded at this time, but are also important and sort of put to the medium term. And then there's some ongoing sort of procedural changes that are recommended as well. And the sort of 5 key short-term priority projects that are outlined. And I mean, these projects include numerous recommendations within each of these that are outlined in the action sort of tables in the final pages of the report. But there's the internal procedures and process, and this is sort of a #1 priority because, as mentioned, in order to implement that software and the IT solutions, this has to be mapped out. And this would be also really great for onboarding new staff and creating standardization of the process. And then that's coupled with some policy and regulations and specifically amendments to like the delegation bylaw if council's interested in considering additional delegation to staff. And then the procedures bylaw would be one that's quite dated and is not as all-encompassing as it should be, and like the consideration of new legislation. So those would be real priorities, those ones. We've also, within the grant, talked about some amendments to the zoning bylaw and subdivision servicing bylaw that would streamline processes, reduce areas where there's interpretation issues and so on. The grant funding with those is quite limited. And I know that the zoning bylaw especially is a project of staff's as well. So we could kind of couple in and support that project based on the eligibility of the grant. And then communications and just industry outreach, I think, is something that the industry really noted that they'd like more of. And I think with COVID, there was quite a bit going on. You know, COVID maybe put a bit of a stop to that, but restarting it, and there is some funding in this grant to also support staff in that role, because it is something that does take some time. And it's going to be really important as you're changing your processes, and also potentially having software where staff can maybe like see the status of their application and apply online, is that there's going to be need for training and bringing the applicants on board, and in terms of utilizing those tools. And then the web as well. There's in terms of the technical solutions are as mentioned, quite significant portion of about, you know, almost 50% of this grant. So implementation of these technical solutions is a very high priority. And then also the website and just those sort of self-service options as well. And then Development Finance Council, and I've made 2 presentations to this council last year regarding development finance, but continuing to kind of look at the options that are available. You're likely to see some future amendments in the probably not too distant future on the Local Government Act regarding development finance, and sort of being in front of those changes to the city's advantage would also be a recommendation. And there's some funds available for, you know, future presentations to council as well. So with that, you know, we've established a timeline that's also outlined in the report, basically looking that we're with the goal of completing all this work by mid-August. So a lot of it needs to be working simultaneously with each other versus in a sequential way. But because of the time needed for the GIS and technical solutions, you know, it's really important that we get going as soon as possible at the internal processes and procedures. And something that I've been working with staff on sort of in the background as we're getting ready to bring this report forward to council. So I think there's a pretty clear plan as what needs to get done, but certainly time is of the essence now with the grant funding. And then we've got, you know, the bylaw updates as well. So we basically have a fairly large work plan, you know, to get this done, and the money essentially utilized prior to UBCM's deadline of August 15th. And that brings me to the recommendations, which is the outlined on the screen and in your report to move forward with the recommendations of the report. And I'm very happy to answer any questions that council may have at this time.
Council, any questions for Ms. Henderson? Councilor Elliott?
BC has sort of a reputation of being the most difficult province, and one of the most difficult in Ontario, in processing applications for development. Is that when you did your study, or will you start looking at other provinces that are very streamlined or less regimented in their processes?
Well, I think that's, I mean, my focus has always been on British Columbia. I think with Alberta next door, I mean, there's Alberta developers that are doing quite a bit of work in our province. I mean, those comments are often made. But I mean, the context we have is the British Columbia context. My experience is very much the jurisdiction next door, whether that be a city, regional district, or province, is always doing it faster than you. And I mean, that's a very standard thing to do. And I think what is really important is that local governments are talking to each other. It's certainly something that I've always done when I've been on the local government side of the table, is making sure that you're streamlining, you're talking to your neighbors, and that you're on the, you know, cutting edge of making sure that you're doing things you know, as streamlined as possible, but while also fulfilling your roles and responsibilities to the community. But yeah, I mean, there's other ways of doing things for sure, but they're not all that different. And I think there's a huge variation within local governments within British Columbia. For example, if you were to compare Revelstoke to what's going on in, say, Metro Vancouver timelines, where it takes 9 months to a year to get a single family building permit, you know, there's a vast difference from organization to organization and context to context.
I think all the recommendations you suggested there are relevant and very good. I think that's great. Welcome that they're coming in. So that's really positive. The simultaneous processing of like an item for engineering or a council comment or that's important that it happens in multiple phases. You're not just sequentially going down the line. Because I've suffered that in my past experience, and it's changed dramatically in the last couple year or two. And that's
no,
not. But I see that as a win. If we can streamline that, where things are happening on many faces at the same time, then that will move things through quicker. And I think that's a good move that our planning department's made. So,
thank you.
Sorry.
Councilor Charlotte and Councilor Palmer.
Thank you, Your Worship. I was really grateful to read through this report over the weekend. This speaks to a lot of the stuff that I've been advocating for and arguing for a long time, is using technology to enhance our work, not to add to it. I'm curious through the chair what the thought is on this bylaw renewal process and a lot of the work that you described there. I recognize that it's not exactly council's role to be embedded in it, but I can see the value in learning about these new processes are developed and the communications are formed, is for the new council to learn along the way, so that when it comes time to making those decisions and doing those development finance workshops, we know what the council knows what that fits into as context. I'm just curious as to what that might look like in these presentations.
So in my mind, that's a committee of the whole thing, and there could be a commitment from Mr. Simon or Ms. Henderson to bring that forward. But I'll just ask Mr. Simon, where do you see that, or do you need to defer to Ms. Henderson?
Through Your Worship, I can take a crack at it, and Ms. Henderson can fill in the blanks with her experience and anything that I may miss. But Councillor Charlotte, you are correct. There are a lot of operational elements in here in terms of how staff do the job, right? I think the biggest thing for existing council and new council to be aware of is those operational elements take substantial time, and it takes time to get internal processes updated and to get them right and to continually refine them. And while it's not necessarily council's role to be involved in fixing those internal processes and improving them, I think having council as a champion to the community to inform the community that, what you kind of see from the outskirts isn't the whole story. There's a lot of behind the scenes work that goes into even something as simple as drafting a bylaw. There's a few different groups internally at the city that are involved in that, right? So kind of championing that from the outside to make sure that staff can continue to do the important process improvements internally. I think that's my view of where council's role would be at it. Ms. Henderson may have some more to add on to that.
Yeah, sure. Through the chair, I think the key is, I think Paul hit the nail on the head, but there's a number of bylaws here that we're recommending amendment to, and council is, the decision maker on all those bylaws. So when you're looking at the procedures bylaw and things like that, where we're starting to map out the process, there's some real key decision points for council in those bylaws that I think, we need to work through. And you're talking about delegation to staff as well. Those are key decision-making points for council. And then based on that direction, we'll get into the nitty-gritty, which, one councilor I know in another community kind of talks about, like playing with the trains. Like we're talking about real technical details that council can definitely, look at, but probably doesn't have that level of interest in. And then when you get to even the software and that development community outreach, I think that outreach is also really important to council, because when you're in the grocery store and somebody is asking, oh, where's my application at? We want you to be able to go look at the status of application on your mobile device or computer, and you get home and maybe give an applicant a call back as well, so that, or teach them how to do it potentially. So council has a role in this for sure.
All right, thank you. Councilor Palmer?
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. Thank you, Nancy and Paul, and for the work on this. It's good. The interesting on the surveys, it's pretty positive actually. And it would have been an interesting exercise to have had those same questions a couple of years prior, I think it might have been quite different. A question, so on that survey, so there's, I forget how many of the applicants, does this include the council comments and staff comments, or is this exclusively the numbers in there, like the graphical representation, or is it just the applicants?
Yeah, through the chair, the representation from the survey is strictly the development community. And it was noted several times by many of the people that we discussed that they noted significant improvements in the last couple of years. And I'm sure if we did that survey now, again, there would be even more improvements.
Great. So it's encouraging. One really minor thing, this is in a draft form right now. You might want to consider differentiating the color very good versus very poor. I found that slightly confusing. So maybe making very good green rather than close color. At least that's how it works in the paper. Minor thing. On the timeline, so you've got this ambitious thing, and you showed a little bit of the timeline, but there was just, you know, gaps and not real milestones as such, a Gantt chart or something. I don't know if you have that internally. So there's just a note, and I suppose maybe more of a note for the CAO. How are you going to ensure all this stuff gets done? It's because August is going to be here before you know it, and you got to get it through a new council. And yeah, so yeah, just yeah, I think you get it. I say, okay, is this gonna? That's a lot of stuff, and those action items, though, just for clarity to Ms. Henderson. So these, all those ones that you have of the immediate are within the funding mechanism. So we have money there somehow that's going to magically make sure all this stuff is done by August. Is it August 1st or August 30th? Yeah. So anyway, I think that's just what it's a pretty ambitious program. So.
Yeah, and good to see it. So any other comments or questions for Ms. Henderson? Seeing none, I will call the question that this approvals process modernization summary report dated September 28, 22 be approved. So all in favor? Motion's carried. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Henderson. Thank you, Mr. Simon. Appreciate it. Gives you the mandate to move forward on getting the work done. Moving on to 11D, Development Permit Amendment 2018-01. Someone want to put this on the table for me, please? Councillor Charlotte.
The amended development permit DP 2018-01 be issued for the construction of a hotel at 2955 Camosi Road, Lot 1, Section 13, Township 23, Range 2, west of the 6th Meridian, Kootenay District Plan, NEP 8740-491.
PID.
PID 027-650-332.
Seconder for the motion, please. Councillor Elliott. Mr. Simon, you have a bit of a presentation.
To your worship, no presentation, but just broadly speaking, this is an amendment for the Heli Hotel located at the Revelstoke Mountain Resort. And they are looking at amending the development permit to allow for the addition of a covered patio on the western portion of the subject building.
Okay, thank you for that. Any questions or comments from council?
So there
Councillor Elliott.
there is contention from the neighbor.
Yeah, there's a letter there, and you've all read that. Ms. Bowen has provided her thoughts, and so do you want to weigh in anything?
No, I just, was there mitigation? I think initially when it came to council, there was a bunch of trees that were to be left in that zone. Is that right? In that interface between the two?
Mr. Simon, comment on landscaping, sound abatement, etc.
Through your worship to Councillor Elliott, there's no changes to landscaping from the original approval as it was issued, as this is going to be, sitting above on the second story. And the requirements outlined in the noise assessment that was completed for the original permit will still remain there as requirements on the development permit. So this is strictly just a form and character amendment to allow for a patio on the western facing building. All the original conditions of the development permit will be required to be adhered to.
So from the planning department, they're in assenting to it or
They're giving approval.
giving it the stamp of approval or?
Yeah,
Comment, Simon?
So through your worship, to Councillor Elliott, the planning department in their assessment has found that it's consistent with the development permit area guidelines and recommend issuance of the permit.
Councillor Palmer.
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. A few questions. I wasn't here. I think this was during this council term that approved this.
Correct.
It was before came in on council. Some of these questions, maybe others know the answers to them already, but so if I recall correctly, there was some controversy with the neighborhood on the development itself. It seemed to be bigger than what was in the original master plan, and we're not going to be reversing that. But it seems to me that there was concern about noise. I remember watching one of the videos about trucks going in behind and how this was going to be mitigated. In the original application, as far as nuisance noise coming from this development, was there restrictions in the original development permit because of the concerns around noise?
Restrictions on delivery, that sort of thing?
Well, delivery or on the building itself. Because it would seem to me it was obvious at the time that a patio on the backside facing that direction was not anticipated. So that's where the question's coming from.
Okay, Mr. Simon, comment?
Through your worship, I know that there were some restrictions on the loading operations and the location of the loading operations. That is not being changed as a result of this amendment. And I know that there was restrictions on the windows on the far western side of the building not being allowed to open. And again, that restriction itself isn't being removed as a result of this permit. It would just be allowing for a patio on the western facing portion of the building.
Further comment, Councilor Palmer?
Yeah, so to council, it seems, there was approvals, there was changes that were made, there was compromises made at the time. And when I look at the windows saying, okay, well, windows were put in that couldn't open because of potential nuisance noise. And now we've got a patio in this area, that there's a contradiction from the original concern, original development permit. So I sort of wonder why, I guess, and then is this just sort of a slippery slope where we're going on the development permit? Based on that alone, I am certainly questioning the merits behind this. Another question, Mayor Sulz, then to staff is, we have a letter from one of the neighbors. Was there a general like that sort of an area that went out to the broader neighborhood? Is that what happened there? And maybe you could just explain, if that occurred, what was brought back?
Mr. Simon, if you could weigh in on that, please.
Through your worship, this is simply an amended development permit application. So there is no statutory requirement to do any type of public consultation. I think what Councillor Palmer you're referring to would be what we do for a development variance permit. We send out notification letters within a 100-meter radius of the subject property. In this particular circumstance, there was no requirement to do that legislatively, but staff did want to ensure that arguably the most impacted property, being the one immediately abutting it to the west, was informed that this was an application that was being brought before council, even though it wasn't legislatively required. It was determined to be the most appropriate thing to make sure that that individual had the opportunity to be informed of the proposal.
So through the mayor, then, so it just, a letter went out to just one, and as one neighbor as a courtesy.
Through your worship, yes, that's correct.
Okay, so I am not supportive of the recommendation or the motion on the table. And to the community, I think that this would, we talk about variances in development permit, and hopefully we understand as council, although we get confused quite a bit too, but it feels like the same kind of impacts, and especially because there was a controversy before on noise impacts. I don't think that this is an appropriate motion that's before us at this point.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments from council? Councilor Brooksville.
I concur completely with Councillor Palmer, I was on council at the time. There was a lot of compromise to mitigate the impact on the adjoining property, such as the windows that don't open. I feel like this is completely going back on all of the work that was done initially to mitigate that impact. It's like, why have windows that don't open when there's a patio that presumably they'll try to get a liquor license for? Why is there limit on the hours of delivery trucks when you're gonna have people drinking till 2 a.m? It doesn't make any sense.
Okay, thanks for your comment, Councillor Shalit.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm also not leaning towards supporting this motion. I agree. The conversation we had was quite a robust conversation to make this hotel as compatible as possible with the surrounding areas. When it was a change in the original master plan, I appreciate that there needs to be flexibility, but that flexibility should go both ways. I agree with my fellow councillors that closed windows, to me, if the windows cannot open, then an open patio is not smart. I don't think that it negates all the work we did, and I don't think that they'll be out there partying till 2. I'm sure that there would be a more reasonable expectation of activity on that patio. However, if the windows cannot open, putting a patio on at this point, I don't think is consistent with the conversation we had at that time.
Okay, thank you for that comment. Any other comments from council?
Maybe just a question on overall square footage of the patio. Is it significant?
17 feet wide by 149 feet long, is that correct? Mr. Simon?
Through your worship, I believe that is correct. I just have to double check the drawings, but I believe that's approximately correct.
So unfortunately, I speak in feet rather than in metric.
Yeah, I spent some time in Worcester, Blackcomb, the interaction between the residences that are there as tourist accommodations and the tourist operator are pretty amiable, and there's a lot of, you go, what's the main, I forgot the name of the pub, but anyway, the relationship is good there between the residents and the operators of the restaurants and businesses, and those type of entities. I agree with council. I believe we've conceded enough on this thing, but I just don't.
Well, I'm of a different mind. I'm supportive of this process and what staff have gone through to kind of look at this, whether this is good. It is a covered deck. It is going to be attached to a restaurant, so there'll be limited times as far as opening goes. I think really, the way it'll come forward will have to be policed by the restaurant. There's no doubt about it, but I'm supportive of it. It's on the western side. They've got a great view. I look at that sort of thing and go, okay. So I'm supportive of it, and I'll leave it at that. So Councillor Elliott.
Is there a way we could stipulate operating hours, like no later than 9 o'clock or 8:30 at night?
Well, it is a restaurant, so I'm not sure what that sort of timeline is. Really, what time do restaurants open, close, that sort of thing, and I really don't know.
I think you could stipulate, people separate when you can operate on the patio, have guests on the patio.
Comment? No,
I don't know for sure.
Councillor Shalit.
Just reading through the noise impact assessment in Schedule G that is attached to the report in our package.
Yep.
It looks like quiet hours are defined as nighttime hours from 11 p.m. till 7 a.m. Monday to Saturday, and 11 p.m. to 9 a.m. on Sundays and holidays. That this would still, if it's still pertaining to the noise impact assessment and the requirements from that, then that was the requirements that were put on there.
Sure, and that would probably remain.
Well, we could modify that. We could say 6 o'clock at night, there's no more patio time. Or 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock at night. We can stipulate that as part of the process. If they're amenable to it, I don't know. It's just an option.
Well, so those are the sorts of things we have to ask staff. I mean, so Mr. Simon, let me bring that back to you. Are those things within a council's purview when we talk about those?
Through your worship, generally speaking, the city has the noise control bylaw, which is what the noise assessment that Councillor Charlotte is referring to is reflecting those requirements in the noise bylaw. If it's related to the development permit area guidelines, then council can, in theory, put a condition on the development permit to add some restrictions as it sees fit. generally speaking, and I know this is an amendment to an existing permit, so it might be a different territory. But generally speaking, for a development permit, if council refuses a permit, they need to advise on, what conditions would need to be met in order for the permit to be issued. If the hours of operation are the main point of contention here, then I would argue that council would be able to look at putting a condition on it to satisfy their concerns if council feels it's related to the development permit area guidelines.
Okay. So any comment from council after hearing that, Council Palmer?
So basically what we're saying is put a restriction on a patio so that it's not really functional at the prime time as the patio. So there's a better way of doing that, and it's denying the application.
Well, that's one way. That's shutting the door on development and sending a message. Yeah, that's one way.
So that's my perspective on that. So and because of the history and where we're going, and I was thinking about the Whistler experience. Mayor Sulz, you were at Whistler. It was Councillor Charlotte, and there was social events. I don't think any of us stayed. Maybe. I didn't stay past 11 o'clock at any of those events, but certainly some of them. I remember one of them was within a hotel that had a huge patio area. It was contained within the confines of their own thing, and that made sense. And the Whistler example isn't a really good example because they don't have hotels with overlooking residential areas in the way that's being done here. That was a compromise that council made before. So I think it's important to uphold those, principles that this council had back on January 22nd, 2019. In, maybe a question for council of the controversy at that time, would this have been approved at that time? And I think the answer is, from what I see anyways, is clearly no.
Okay. All right. Any other comments from council?
If the hours are not an option, why not frontage? That's an option too. I mean, where do we say you could put glass up there and muffle the sun?
So
that's fully an option. I mean, we do it on patios now. So, there's all kinds of things that you could, but you're saying no. It's a horrible precedent we keep saying.
Thank you, Your Worship. And I just want to clarify, I'm not saying no to the development. I'm saying yes to the development as we already approved it.
Yeah.
I don't disagree. If the patio can be built so that it is closed and there are no openable windows as was originally agreed, then that would be another conversation. I don't know that it's going to get the same appeal, but maybe that solarium, lots of windows to capture that beautiful view without opening the guests up to the residential areas that surround that hotel. That certainly could be a conversation. It gets tricky when I understand that it's staff that are having these conversations and it comes to council when it's something that's contentious. And the only reason I say contentious is because it was early in our term and it had seemed to go sideways in a lot of ways. Whether it would have passed with this patio or not, hard to say. There was a lot of emotion flying around at that time, and I don't want to see the same thing at this point. So I will stand by my initial concern was if the windows are closed to the rest of the hotel, then an open patio does not jive with that for me.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would say you can make amendments. They're coming with a business proposition that they think is going to be more viable. And we're saying, stick with the guns. This is the only thing we're going to allow you. You can't come up with options.
Would you allow 2 minutes of input?
Please.
Your Worship. Your Worship.
Just a moment.
Yeah.
Mayor Sulz, I think it's important to contain the decorum that's within, and there's been quite a bit of deterioration in this meeting already on that. So I think it's important.
We're going to leave it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other comments? Council Charlotte.
I'm curious as to what, and I'm just pulling up the report here for options. Because I don't know what that kind of compromise would look like in good process. Would it be referring this to committee? Would it be referring back to staff to work with the proponent? Would it be?
Comment, Mr. Simon?
To your worship, or through your worship, Councillor Charlotte, if council did choose to go with option one, specified in alternative options in the report, they could give direction to, basically be direction to the applicant. And what I'm hearing from council is that they want to see the original conditions of the development permit adhered to fully, that there would be no exterior windows on the westernmost portion of the building that would have the ability to open. And if the applicant is able to amend their proposal to include the patio in a way that doesn't allow for it to be an open patio, if that makes sense, then council could, choose to go with that option to give the applicant direction on, what they would need to see to be able to support the proposal.
Okay, so any comments from council regarding that, Councillor Palmer?
Yeah, so just sort of tying it back to our other decision regarding the development permit area for the whole area, that's why I'm keen to have that conversation with RMR on that so that we can have at least understanding. I think we're trying to fix a problem now that belongs with the developer and staff. I think we should just deny this, and if there's something more that they could come back, we don't need to give additional, start trying to create what's going to work for them.
Okay, any other comments from council regarding motion on the table?
I would say that cut and dry approach to business and opportunities is wrong. That's my take. You can have your opinion, but I think we should be offering flexibility. Bring it. Let's see and negotiate.
Okay, I appreciate that comment as well. So, you have another comment, Councillor Charlotte?
I'm wondering what that would look like. Would that be an amendment Elliott would have to make to be able to use option one, or is it denying this motion that's on the table and then making a new motion?
Okay, for some reason, I'm not seeing motion option one in my electronic stuff. Where am I missing this?
Near the end of the report,
Page 3, which is page 143 of 270.
So Mayor Sulz, I could read it out.
Yes, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay, option one, council may request changes to the proposal to ensure alignment with the applicable development permit area regulations. Council would need to specify why the proposal does not align with applicable guidelines and indicate that what changes are needed by the applicant to align. And then any conditions. And so this is where we are starting to try to be the planner here.
Yeah.
So I think that's beyond our ability and sort of understanding, as far as being very specific without hearing. I think if we deny it, the application, RMR will work with staff if there's some better way to address the concerns. They've heard our concerns here at the table now.
Okay, and I appreciate comments from all of council. Councillor Elliott, I don't disagree with you regarding your statement. However, is there any other comments? If not, I'm going to call the question. So the motion on the table is to say yes to the amended development permit. A denial of that means that you're voting no. So for those who are in favor, please raise your hand. Note that Councillor Elliott and Mayor Sulz are in favor. Those opposed, note that the balance of council is opposed. This motion is defeated. All right, let's move on to item 11E, change of address for 9th Street. Someone want to put that motion on number 1, please. Councillor Brookshill.
The 506 9th Street East, lot 22, 23, and 24, block 64, plan NDP 925, section 27, township 23, range 2, meridian, as in the package, be readdressed to 510 9th Street East.
Okay, seconder for that motion, Councillor Ryan. Any further discussion on that motion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Item number 2, please. Councillor Brookshill.
That 508 9th Street East, which is as in the package, be readdressed to 514 9th Street East.
Seconder for the motion, Councillor Ryan. Any discussion on that motion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Motion's carried. Moving on to item F, Williamson Lake Park Campground. Councillor Ryan.
That submission of a land tenure application to facilitate the installation of a fishing dock at Williamson Lake Park and Campground be approved.
Seconder for the motion, Councillor Charlotte. Ms. Donato, you're here. Do you want to give a bit of a explanation or presentation?
Thank you, Your Worship. I will just reiterate a little bit about the project. If Council recalls, in April of last year, Council issued a letter of support for the Rod and Gun Club Society to initiate work on getting a fishing dock through the Freshwater Fisheries Society of BC. So I have been in correspondence with the project coordinator, and everything seems to be in order. A couple of weeks ago, I did receive notice that the city would be required to make a land tenure application prior to the installation of the dock. And part of that requirement requires a council resolution in support of the application. That's why you have this report before you. So I can answer any questions if council has any of me.
Okay. Did we put this motion on the table?
Yes.
Any discussion on the motion? Any questions, concerns? Councillor Palmer.
Just a comment, Mayor Sulz. So just, I'm pleased to see this going ahead. I think the community is. There's diverse uses at Williamson Lake, and I think it's just flagging about how important this asset is to their community. We've had discussions before at the council level. And so let's really look after this asset that we have, this lake, in future development. Thanks.
Any other comments? Saying none?
Maybe a question. How are we progressing on the improvements that were outlined 5 years ago or so? Are we making amendments to the campground?
Well, they're working on the road right now, putting in infrastructure. So, Mr. Black, are you still on? Do you want to weigh in on that?
Yes, Your Worship, thank you. We are installing a true water main and a fire hydrant on Williamson Lake Road in the next few weeks. We've developed engineering drawings to support 2 lanes in with parking on one side and a 3-meter wide multi-use path that will go down from airport to the campground itself. We've also managed to acquire some land from RMR for the road, which was partially on their land. So that's good. And then the shower facility should be open with adequate water pressure for next year.
So just a second. Mr. Nato, any further comments on some of the things that are being built, the shower and how things are being operated? Do you have any further comment on that?
We will be moving forward with some landscaping improvements in the new season coming up in 2023. And we are also in conversations with some other funding opportunities for a dock replacement for the swimming platform as well, which we hope to be able to proceed with next year as well.
Great, thank you. And so for me, just shows you how old I am. Didn't we just replace this? Right? I know it's been years, but now look at that. Councillor.
Does that area have a septic arrangement, or does it tie into the city line?
It is currently on septic system.
Are there intentions to make the area I guess we don't have a sewer line down that far.
Mr. Black, comment?
Through your worship, that is correct. To Councillor Elliott, that would be a future project that should development occur in that area that is within the city limits. As you're aware, there's a gap in the city limits, which is on Airport Road, basically from Williamson Lake on Airport Road. And so that is part of the CSRD. And we'll have to enter into some future negotiations for acquisition or expansion of the city boundary, or working to bring another lift station in to provide sanitary service in that area.
Sorry, I'm on a rant. What are the possibilities, what would be required to make that a year-round use as an RV center?
I mean, is there an RV park?
As an RV park, winter, year-round.
Lori,
Well,
may I? Okay, go ahead, sorry.
So we have been through this exercise where we did review the site in terms of making it a full year campsite. The site is really small, so depending on what type of recreational vehicle you'd want to see on the site would determine how many units we could actually get on the site. We currently don't manage any of the snow on the site. We plow the road so that there's access to the existing residential property. But in terms of doing snow removal within that site, there is not a lot of room to store the snow if we were to open up the campsite. The services, we typically turn off the water service because it's shallow and it's not able to be on during the winter months. So it really does limit the number of units that we could see on that site. And then there's the administrative part about managing a winter campsite as well. I don't know, Steve, if you have anything further to add on the services.
No, I think I was aware of the shallow water lines and the septic system, but I also know that there are other operators who have land, are charging $700 or $800 a month for pad rent on an RV site. And I'm saying, whoa, there's revenue for 30 or 40 RVs potentially for 10 months of the year. And I'm saying,
we don't have space for that many RVs.
well, that's how many sites there are right now. There are 40 campsites. Maybe we narrow it down to 30 RV sites. I don't know, Gary. I'm just throwing suggestions.
Sure.
Again, it's looking for business opportunities.
Good comment made. Any other questions? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried. Correspondence, we dealt with the letter in the dealing with the development permit. Tourism Initiatives Committee meeting minutes. Anyone want to make a comment on that? Seeing none. Revelstoke and Area Economic Development Committee meeting minutes of September 14th. Seeing none. Ms. Floyd, Ms. Rousseau, do we have any questions from the press?
No questions from the press, Your Worship.
All right, so Council, I will now ask for termination of the meeting. Moved by Councillor Ryan, seconded by Councillor Charlotte. All in favor? Motion's carried. Thank you for your time. Appreciate that.
All right, listen.